Hi, everybody, and welcome to uh, Canopy's Tree Talks for the day. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Nicole Rycroft, the founder and executive director of Canopy. If you don't know us already, Canopy is a solutions-driven, not-for-profit organization, and we work to protect the world's forest species and climate and help advance frontline community rights. And I'm so excited for today's conversation, in which I get to host what promises to be, I hope anyway, a compelling conversation. If I do my part of the job well, then it'll be compelling, because I know that John will definitely be a compelling conversationalist. So I'm joined by John Vaillant, who is a renowned author and whose narratives weave together environmentalism, history, and the essence of human nature, which is one of the things I find really beautiful about his works. He's had a very illustrious career and really kind of given us brilliant books from The Golden Spruce and The Tiger, which was one of my favorite birthday presents ever. Which that illuminate and kind of tease out the sometimes fraught relationship that there is between humanity and the natural world. His latest work, Fire Weather, draws us into the searing heat and heart of wildfires and the phenomenon that is exacerbated by the climate crisis that we at Canopy are dedicated to combating day after day. So at Canopy, we work to protect and conserve the world's ancient and endangered forests, which are critical in regulating our climate. And the escalating frequency and intensity of wildfires is both symptomatic of our changing climate and a climate that forests help to stabilize if we actually keep them standing and help protect them. So in this Tree Talk session, we're going to explore that interconnectedness between human activity, what it is to be human in this world, the climate crisis and wildfires. And I think John's gripping storytelling is going to help guide us through not only the story of the 2016 Fort McMurray, Alberta wildfire, which spread across almost 600,000 hectares of land and destroyed thousands of buildings and was the costliest disaster in Canadian history, showing and monetizing the kind of impact of the climate crisis at our front door. We will look to stop at the top of the hour so everybody can move into their days, their afternoons, their evenings, their mornings, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. And we will have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So make sure that you're kind of tracking, thinking all those questions that you've stored up and have always wanted to ask John. Feel free to hold them. And so with that, John, welcome. Thanks so much for being part of this series. And thanks for just your, I think, the eloquence and your dedication to kind of the environmental sphere with your bodies of work.
Oh, well, thank you, Nicole. It's really a pleasure to be with you and everybody out there. I'm glad to join you all.
Fantastic. So, John, I remember my first introduction to you was with the Golden Spruce, which will be the case for many people. And then, of course, the Tiger and Fire Weather. I think the thing that really strikes me is like both the density of the books and how deeply you dive into it, as well as just your ability to sort of weave what is quite dense kind of subject matter into these fascinating stories and events that kind of really kind of lift and transcend and pull people through really strong environmental themes and experiences. And so, I know that we've had this conversation before, but I was wondering if you can, like, how did you become a tree hugger? When did you become a tree hugger?
Well, I balk a little bit at the tree hugger term because I really
which I know as well, which I thought it's like, let's just get it started with a little bit of provocation.
No, I really embrace life and the humans too. I don't we all have a place here. And the forest, obviously, is our collective canopy, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. We are a forest people, really evolved, as a forest species. We came out of the trees and we can live in the open lands, open country, the savanna. But trees occupy a special place for us. And I grew up in New England. One of the bonding activities I had with my dad as a teenager was cutting trees down with the chainsaw. I'm very good with skilled with a saw. It's something I actually really enjoy doing. And that might seem at odds, but as a forest person, interacting with the woods, it's part of life, in the world that I grew up in. At the same time, it was really interesting speaking to loggers, professional fallers in British Columbia, when I was researching the golden spruce. These are guys, cutting down 500-year-old trees. And I timed a fellow, Earl Einerson, and it took him 10 minutes to drop a 500-year-old red cedar. And the sound it made hitting the earth was thunderous, and it shook the ground, and it cleared a huge swath of forest as it fell. And that was a really shocking thing to behold. And, I was cutting down little tiny trees back east, but this is something else. This felt a little bit more like shooting rhinoceroses or something like that, which is
a different life force.
It's a different life force. That is a very hard activity to get behind. And I talked with Earl about that. And he's a mushroom picker. He's a hunter, spends a lot of time in the woods, has a great affinity for that, for the coast. And he said, I guess it's kind of crazy to love something and go out and kill it. And I just admired his honesty there. And he's living in the dissonance, in the conundrum of being a human being. And all of us, things die so that we can live. There's no way around that. And he was out literally on the cutting edge of that, on the bleeding edge of that fact, that really hard, cold fact. And we really connected around that question, and there's really no answer to it there. And one of the things that I came away with from writing Fire Weather is we live in a both and world. That the two things can be true at the same time, or there can be two opposing needs that we find ourselves compelled to negotiate. And it's an enormous challenge, being us right now, and especially seeing the pressures that we exert on the earth reflecting back to us in very painful ways.
Yeah, to be human is inherently to live with contradiction, right? And I think that is the challenge of our times, right? Like, we don't have an environmental problem. We have a kind of like a human behavior problem, and kind of how we manage ourselves within the realities of the natural world. And so I think how even within ourselves as individuals, let alone how we do it at a societal level, how we kind of manage those contradictions is really the essence of our work. John, you've been in British Columbia for quite a while now, on the West Coast. And I think one of the things that is so strong within your books is that you write not only within your books, but also in editorials, about the natural world and human impact, and how humans are shaping natural landscapes. How has kind of witnessing things like an ancient forest being kind of mowed down, how does witnessing those kinds of changes firsthand, how's that affected your outlook and your approach to conservation and to climate action?
It's been absolutely profound, and I'm deeply indebted to the rawness and the liveliness and the relative intactness of the West Coast compared to where I grew up in New England, which was effectively a totally manicured anthropogenic landscape. And what we call clear cuts on the West Coast, which are really horrifying fields of total destruction, back where I grew up, those were fields. Things grew in them. You might have some hay in there. You might have some corn in there. And then there'd be a beautiful line of maples or maybe white pine running along the edge of the field. And it was all controlled and compartmentalized. And likewise, the original inhabitants, First Nations, were invisible. There
Right.
are still members of First Nation, East Coast First Nations living on the East Coast, but we never saw them.
Mm.
They were presented to me growing up as a historical artifact. And when you went to an anthropology museum back east, the things that the first inhabitants made were presented as relics of a lost civilization. When I came to Vancouver and went to the Museum of Anthropology, there was a First Nations man carving a pole inside the museum.
Right.
It was alive. And my wife and I that really was one of the things that inspired us to move here is this continuity. And it felt very hopeful to me. It felt very honest to me. Here you can feel more directly the consequences of what you're losing. And back east, it was gone already.
Yeah.
It was already, completely controlled and reconfigured. And out here, that isn't resolved yet. And thank goodness. And so this felt like a more honest place to be, much more challenging place to be. It's easier to live back there. It's all done. It's settled. We'll just make do with what we have. Here on the West Coast, we're still in tension. And so, and it feels in a way, there are a lot of front lines on planet Earth, but this is one of the front lines. And Canopy's work and the vulnerability of forests out here really intersect here, and you can really feel how high the stakes are. And I understand that a significant chunk of Clayoquot Sound has just been secured. And, that's a 40-year-old, 30-year-old battle.
Campaign.
Yeah,
almost secured. If the Ahousaht and Tulukwit nations kind of vision is actually fulfilled, then yes, it'll be a significant advance for conservation on the West Coast in Clayoquot. But their vision is as is party with kind of due process in British Columbia. There's a public consultation period that is on for the next 30 days. But yes, after many years of campaigning and very strong leadership from the Indigenous nations in that area as well.
Yeah, no, it's really amazing. And it just even that process was really unheard of, back east. A big issue, what we would be involved in back there would be more, and I'm sure it's changed now. I've been gone a long time, but back then it was more, we would protest a nuclear power plant or something like that. But these are very kind of Western, modern, technological issues. And here, this notion of staying connected to the land, protecting the land, being an advocate for the land, is feels more front and center. Partly because things are just bigger. There's just a grandeur here and a kind of that notion of charismatic megafauna. Well, we have charismatic megaflora out here on the West Coast, and they loom over you, and so you really have to pay attention. It's quite wonderful.
It is both inspirational and, as you say, it is a frontier, right? It is a front line to hold on to. You kind of mentioned just then around kind of some of the technological solves, and it reminded me that in the recent New York Times op-ed that you penned, fires sweeping across Texas offer a terrifying warning. And I mean, that took me by surprise, like that extent of wildfires in Texas in February. And you mentioned the term clima incognita. And so I was just wondering if you could kind of tease that out a little bit, kind of how you see sort of the dissonance or the gap, the kind of passing of in the middle of the night between scientific understanding of the climate crisis and what needs to happen, and then public awareness and perception, um, and we can move from that into then sort of like the policy gap or the kind of inertia or perhaps the lack of substantive movement on the policy side.
So climate change, climate disruption has a real advantage over us in that it does things that we don't expect. And in effect, it does kind of what MAGA conservatives do in the United States and increasingly in Canada, which is they violate norms. They violate the norms that we set our lives by. And so when you get these types of storms or colossal fires that firefighters really have no recourse or adequate response to, it creates this an incredible dissonance and confusion. And one of the things we need to deal with it, first of all, is a common language. And so I think there's a temptation, this brings up also the Lucretius problem, this notion of basing your responses, basing your ideas of what a big fire is on past experience, when what climate change is showing us is you ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to show you by the climate, planet Earth, I'm going to show you fires, the likes of which you've never seen before, and for which, you really have no technical or even intellectual precedent. And so we grope around for ways to describe that. Do we call it a megafire? Do we call it the new normal? And I was pushing back in that op-ed against this notion of the new normal because, for one thing, it's too glib. For another, it sounds like, oh, we're just going to find a new plateau and stabilize there. This is the new normal. And there's nothing normal about it, and there's nothing stable about it. And so, what I called it, and it's clumsier, it's not nearly as alliterative as the new normal, which sounds great, is clima incognita, which is like terra incognita. It's the unknown climate. And on these old maps, from the 16th century, people were navigating
off the edge of the earth.
They'd sail off the edge of the world, and they, there was this notion of terra incognita, the unknown land, and here be dragons. And there are dragons in our future, and some of them are made of fire. And Texas was, the Texas Panhandle was overrun, excuse me, by the biggest fire in its history. Texas is a big state, the size of Alberta. It has colossal fires in its past. Fire is not abnormal in February, but a 1.4 million acre fire that surpassed the last biggest fire in 3 days of burning and 4 days of burning, running at 50 miles an hour. That's, that fire killed a fire chief.
Right.
I don't know how he died exactly, but it's like generals don't usually die. I've never really heard of a fire chief dying in a fire. And other people died too, not to mention untold numbers of cattle and homes were destroyed. And so this is all still going, by the way. These fires aren't out. It's going to could go all year, as fires have been doing in British Columbia this past winter. So we are in a new world that needs a new language. And that's, I feel, I'm a writer, I'm someone who works with language, who's sort of trying to build bridges between science, which can often be opaque, as accurate as it is, as necessary as it is. They use a different language than we do. And so one of my roles is to try to translate that and convey that, and also to convey the urgency of the messages scientists are carrying. And that, that often gets lost in the translation, literally. So
climate science is very dense, right? And so it's not, to sit down and curl up on the couch with a cup of tea with the latest IPCC report is, it's an endeavor, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, and humans, we are wired we tend to take action, to feel compelled to protect those that we love and what we feel, right? Like, we don't necessarily change our behaviors because of what we know by itself. And so what I love about your work, and many of your peers that are writers or artists within the creative industries, is translating into a more emotional landscape, into a more emotional realm and experience what the science, what the science is actually telling us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm following my own emotions, when I'm working on a story. I have a relatively short attention span. When I get too in the weeds, technically, and I feel my eyes roll back, and that's a signal. And so I know, when I'm trying to convey a story or convey a concept, I'm the guinea pig. And when I start to get bored, or when I start to lose focus, or when I start to just not understand it anymore, I realize, okay, I've got to back up here and distill it. And really, a lot of you are talking about kind of the density of my books. And, it's a mixed blessing, but what's going on there is a lot of distillation and trying to get to a kind of accessible and nourishing essence that others, who are not in the field, of logging or tiger biology or fire behavior, can relate to and resonate to. And how you do that is through how I do that, as a human being, is through other human beings. And so finding my way into the story through their experiences, their emotions, their thought process, I can sort of drop in there. They become avatars for us, on the journey into this, what's for us an unknown world, but for them, for loggers or tiger biologists or firefighters, this is the world they know. And so they're our guides, and they're often, extraordinarily eloquent. That's, one of the jobs of the writer is to hear and the poetry that's all around us and highlight it. And so, in fire weather, I had these amazing interviews with people who shared incredibly generously of their experiences, many of which were absolutely awful and terrifying and disempowering, often humiliating, in terms of the defeats that they suffered. And yet they shared that with me bravely, and were quite eloquent in the process often. And so that combination, I think, really certainly invited me in, but it invites the reader in. And so, my job is to sort of be a kind of advance eyes and ears, and helps. It's almost like a tour guide, really.
Yeah.
I've found all the interesting places, the good restaurants, the interesting sites, and my job is to take you through those, show them to you, and put them in a larger context. Really, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I'm basically a tour guide into these unusual circumstances.
An experiential curator, or
Okay.
translator,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
So I was in Australia the year of the kind of black summer bushfires, 2019, 2020, and those fires burnt for months and months and months, with incredible destruction of forests and wildlife, and impact on communities. And then even last year in Canada, we lost 15 million hectares of forests during last summer alone to fires. Your book, Fire Weather, which, by the way, congratulations, New York Times bestseller, best book of the year, and winner of the Bailey Gifford Prize. We have an international community that's galvanized around tree talks. And so I'm wondering if you can just unpack for folks a little bit about, the Fort McMurray fire, and what it was that really kind of compelled you to write this book.
Sure. So Fort McMurray is unknown to most people outside Canada. It's a it's a petro town. It's a boom town, 600 miles north of the Montana border in the boreal forest. It's technically in the subarctic of Canada. It's a very remote place, hard to get to, and yet there are permanent and temporary, about 90,000 people up there working the bitumen mines. And it's a just a hard thing to understand when we think of, is it an oil town? Well, they are not drilling for oil there. It is not like Texas. It's not like Saudi Arabia. It's not like the Gulf of Mexico. They are mining bitumen, and bitumen is basically tar. It's what you'd seal your driveway with. And they're doing this on a colossal scale. And it's become, because of this, pretty much the wealthiest municipality in all of Canada. The median household income in 2016, when the fire broke out there, was $200,000 a year. And that's, you have to really, you have to go to, I don't know, Marin County or Westchester in New York, outside of New York City, to find that kind of income. So in the boreal forest is a naturally flammable system, as is the Texas Panhandle. These places are made to burn. It's normal for them to burn. But when you have conditions like we did on May 3rd, 2016, and like we did for a lot of last summer, we had May 3rd, 2016, fires were predicted. There were 5 different fires burning around the city of Fort McMurray. Firefighters were certainly on alert. There's, great firefighting services, municipal and forest in Alberta. And yet the relative humidity that day was 11 or 12%. The temperature was about 33 Celsius. And again, we are in the subarctic. There was ice on the lakes there. There were car-sized blocks of ice on the Athabasca River, which flows through the middle of the city, and yet it was 33 Celsius. The relative humidity was 11%. That doesn't mean a lot to most people, but what it means is it was as dry as Death Valley in the boreal forest. And that's an already flammable ecosystem that has now been made desert dry and desert hot. And what that does is it creates more space, a more kind of commodious, conducive environment for fire to burn and flourish. And that dryness basically does a lot of the front loading that fire normally needs to do. Fire cannot interact with its fuel until it's gotten all the water out of it, till it's got it up to temperature. Well, if the sun and the drought and El Nino and 50 years of drying trends have already dried the forest out, and then you goose the temperature because of accumulated methane and CO2, which are generated in abundance by the tar sands mines and rendering facilities, along with 8 billion people who are busily combusting all the time. You're going to change, you're fundamentally change fire behavior. And so this is one of the, there's a term that the futurist Alex Steffen from Berkeley coined, and it's called discontinuity. And it's where past experience ceases to be a useful guide for current and future scenarios. And so the firefighters there were prepared for a 1990s style wildfire. And they're huge in Alberta. You can burn 1,000 square miles in Alberta and it won't make the news, up north. But this here was a settlement, a huge industrialized city of nearly 100,000 people in the way of this fire. And historically, fire had never crossed into the city. And people imagined that the city was somehow inviolable. And that is a real liability for human beings. We think it can't happen here. Sure, it might happen in Australia. Sure, it might happen in Southern California.
They have bushfires all the time.
Yeah, too bad for them. But we live up here. We are different somehow. And what people found out in an extraordinarily painful way on May 3rd, 2016, was they weren't different. And because it was drier, because it was hotter, the embers, which flew out of the fire, which was projecting radiant heat of 500 Celsius, that's hotter than the planet Venus. So radiant heat, that's the heat that tells you not to touch the candle. That's coming out of the forest across a front 10, 12 kilometers wide, blasting into the city, desiccating everything in front of it, getting it up way past combustive temperatures. So these neighborhoods where children had been playing that morning were now literally hotter than Venus. So even before the flame came, everything in there, the trees, the wooden fence, the rubber tires, the vinyl siding on the homes, the tar shingles, all of it started to off-gas hydrocarbons. And that's why fire is hot. Fire is hot so it can heat up the fuel so it starts to off-gas, because that's what fire engages with. It can't burn a solid object. It heats the object up and still until it starts to release hydrocarbons. So now the fire coming into the city, casting embers in front of it, is arriving not in a neighborhood full of little discrete homes, but into a neighborhood with this huge cloud of hydrocarbon vapor around it. And so the embers land, and every one of them bursts into flame. They can land on a roof, they can land in the grass, they can land in your geraniums. They burst into flame. And what catches everybody by surprise with 21st century fire, a term that I coined for that book because it has certain characteristics that are different from the 20th century, is the speed. No one can believe how fast it happened. And because they're focusing on the flames out there, and then suddenly behind them, their whole hedge is on fire. And, you know, Australians know about this, people down south know about this, but Albertans hadn't really had to deal with this very often, and certainly not in a huge settlement like this that has a highway running through it, that has transmission lines and a big river and all kinds of fire barriers. These barriers had no effect on this fire. The Athabasca River is half a kilometer wide. The fire jumped over it. Jumped over it. And that's because of the embers. So, and again, when it's a little hotter, a little drier, the embers can sustain longer. And they do, and they have more success when they land. It's like seeds. And when seeds fall on the highway, they're not going to grow. But when they fall in moist, damp ground, they've got a really good chance of germinating. And so what's the optimal conditions for fire is hot and dry. And especially when you've had several years of drought, as Alberta has. Alberta now is in stage 4, and it's barely spring. So Alberta's going to have a rough summer. British Columbia is going to have a rough summer. I think this drying and heating trend already, the Midwestern states and provinces are at higher risk for fire. This is moving east. So this is where we are.
I think one of the things that I've been around a number of bushfires throughout my life, with growing up as a kid in Australia, and then unfortunately with moving to the West Coast, it's kind of been a fairly consistent part of summers in British Columbia, which, at least on the coast, has not historically been a wildfire disturbance ecosystem for the most part, but is just the intensity that happens with a fire. And that it becomes its own weather system, right? Like it creates weather itself. And I think what your comments just then spoke so beautifully to that, like just how dry it is, the embers and how they can fly, as well as the winds that are generated, and just what a force it becomes. What kind of reaction have you seen to the book so far? And have you seen it resonate at a local decision maker level, in policy making circles at all? What are you seeing in terms of response?
It's been quite extraordinary, Nicole. Honestly, so the book came out on May 28th, 2023, and I have been doing events not unlike this virtually every day. Online, in person, over the phone, people really want to talk about it. And the book has, it's kind of moving into other languages and film, and people really want to engage with this topic because they feel it. It's not abstract anymore. And I think when fire weather came out in the United States on June 6th, which was the day that that orange cloud settled over Manhattan.
Hmm.
And that was a real wake up for millions of people on the Eastern Seaboard who also, like people in Fort McMurray prior to May 3rd, 2016, felt that this wasn't really my problem. That's a West Coast problem. That's a Southern Hemisphere problem. And I think it really disconcerted and shocked and frightened a lot of people on the Eastern Seaboard to see their world turn orange, to feel the burning in their lungs and eyes. And there was a fire nowhere near them. This was all from Ontario and Quebec. And so they couldn't even see the flames, and yet they were feeling it. So that really brought it home. And in a way, you know, that's the one upside of smoke. You can't hide from it. It doesn't matter how rich you are. You know, you can repair to your lovely hideaway on Nantucket and leave the plebes, you know, to deal with the mainland, but the smoke will follow you there. And that's honest. And, you know, welcome to the
Yep.
world, and you're part of it. You know, there's nowhere to hide here. And
No.
it's unseemly to try to hide. And it's not brave. So this, a lot of people, it galvanized a lot of people. So we've been having these very fruitful conversations and very intense conversations. And there is anger, there is fear, there's confusion, there's despair. So, you know, these events that I've been doing become, you know, turn into kind of almost more like encounter groups or therapy sessions sometimes, because people are really honest about how they're feeling. And on this coast, on the West Coast here, you know, West Van is super vulnerable to fire. You know, you've got these very steep slopes. You've got these really dry trees. Fire loves to run uphill. It loves to burn conifers. I did an event in Powell River, way up the coast in British Columbia, that's ferry access only. And a woman there said, you know, we don't have enough boats to get people out if there's a fire, because
Right.
there's only one road, and the road ends at a ferry, so you're stuck. So that means you can't run uphill. You don't want to run uphill away from a fire. You've got to go down to the water if you're on the coast, as we saw vividly and horribly in Australia. You know, people just hanging out on the beach because there was nowhere else to go. And in Lahaina too, people were literally driven into the water by the flames. And, you know, this is not a movie. This is a scenario. And people, you know, courageous, I think, people on the BC coast are coming to terms with this possibility. And so what do we do? And we didn't plan for that. We didn't build for that. That's the other thing. This is another discontinuity, is the discontinuity of our architecture, of our city layout. Fort McMurray only had one road in. Many, many new developments in the forest, these idyllic places where we want to repair to and live in, often have only one road in, and people don't think about it being blocked by fire. People don't think about where they're going to go. And so we're being forcibly invited, is a nice way to put it, by nature to renegotiate and re-engage.
Right.
And, you know, because we've changed it and it's letting us know.
I think one of the things that I really love about that, just to riff off that point around the from nature here, is that, you know, historically, and this is to quote you and your words rather than me being as eloquent as this, in the New York Times op-ed that you wrote that historically it has been humans who have outpaced the natural world, from arrowheads to artificial intelligence. Our species has progressed steadily faster than geological time. You know, there used to be a reference to, you know, the glaciers are melting faster than, you know, like you're moving on that task. But now geological times, and specifically atmospheric time and ocean time, is moving faster. And so just kind of, I think, leaning into that concept. And, you know, as we step up and step forth to address the climate crisis, you know, how do you balance the gravity of the situation, and it's so easy to kind of just, you know, want to kind of like sort of stay in kind of like a dark space in terms of the stats and developments, and the optimism around the kind of systems change that needs to happen and that we can drive forward. And how do you see sort of technological advances and the natural sort of nature-based solutions and opportunities that there are?
Yeah, a lot of questions there, and
Yes, sorry, there
and
is.
but they are all intertwined with each other. You know, they all belong together, and this we've never been here before as a
Mm-hmm.
species. We've never
Right.
been in a place where temperature and planetary changes were moving faster than species ability to adapt to them. That's a really strange and disconcerting place to be. But in our past are analogous events. So all of us are descended from people who have been through plagues, who have been through wars, who have been through different types of climate collapse regionally, locally. And that's still what it's going to be. You know, we're going to go through regional changes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and we are frankly evolved for that. And that doesn't make it okay. That doesn't mean we can relax. But we are descended from the survivors of past cataclysms. And it can be, you know, a pogrom, or, you know, an ethnic purge, or it can be a
Mm-hmm.
flood, or it can be just a drought, or just the exhaustion of local soils due to over farming. And so any number of things, you know, can force people, can end ways of life and force people into a new mode. We're in such a moment now. We're moving into a new mode. And I coined a term called the Petrocene age, which is the petroleum age, basically 1860, 1870 to now. It is peaking now. Because we all grew up in it, it's our normal, but it isn't normal. It's an absolute freak of human nature. And it's an experiment. And I'm not the first person to say that. Some quite brilliant climate scientists back in the 50s said, you know, Roger Revelle among them said, we are conducting an experiment, a geological experiment on planet Earth by burning fossil fuels in extraordinary quantities, effectively supravolcano quantities. That's if you step back and forget about the people and just look at the combustion that we are perpetrating on planet Earth,
Right.
we are collectively a supravolcano. And supervolcanoes change climates. And that's what we're doing. And so it's extraordinary that we can do that. And it's petroleum that has enabled us to do it in such a rapid fashion. And so we're coming to terms with this in this very intermittent, fragmented way. And William Gibson, another futurist, wonderful writer, said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And that really resonates for me right now. The residents of Fort McMurray got a glimpse of a certain version of the future in May 2016. And that was a real aberration back then. Now we've had Lahaina, now we've had Paradise. Valparaiso is the outskirts of Valparaiso are burning again. 200 people have already been killed down there in fires in the past couple of weeks. Texas burned as it never had before. Parts of Boulder, Colorado were burnt to the ground a couple of years ago, and not to mention Oregon and Washington and California. So we're in this new place where things are accelerating, and our response to it is patchy at best. But we are responding to it. And so, you know, if you folk, you know, and I really feel for marine biologists whose file is coral reefs. You know, that is a desperate and dispiriting file to be on. And I don't see the upside there. I don't know how we get out of that one. But there are other things happening, you know, and this is honestly one reason you know, you'll see in my books occasionally this sort of global view of things it's a retreat for me. If I stay in the micro, especially the dark micro, too much, it's soul destroying. And so really have to come back and look at the big picture. And we have to acknowledge the fact that Chevron has just voluntarily relinquished its petroleum leases on the west coast of British Columbia. All those leases, as I understand it, have now been retired. There's going to be no oil drilling off the coast of British Columbia. British Columbia is a massive coastline, way bigger than California. So to have that all secured from drilling, we have to take that as a win. We have to take Clayoquot Sound as a win. We have to take the fact that the UK has reduced its per capita emissions to 1880s levels as a win. And that's if the UK can do it, we can do it. The UK is not a model of progress and democratic action. That is a crippled country in many ways. And there's some really potent progressive action on climate and emissions reduction.
Yeah, we see in our work, which is very solutions path driven, and how do we compress the timeline over which we can transition from these take, make, waste supply chains and production systems to fundamentally more circular, lower carbon, lower impact, so that we can keep forests standing, given that they are kind of one of the cheapest, fastest, most cost-effective ways for us to stabilize our climate is really just to keep them standing. We see that there is an incredible appetite and galvanization around how do we scale the solutions that are necessary, both technological as well as natural, as well as, I was speaking at an investment conference yesterday from, creatives such as yourself through to investors and corporate decision makers, and even in some instances policy decision makers. I think the IRA in the US was a really quite a bold piece of legislation at that scale. We're seeing sort of the shifts towards disruptive times call for creative measures. And I think we're starting to see that kind of at scale. I do want to, I could continue to ask you questions, but I know that we have a couple that have come in. So maybe I can just move over and ask one of them. Okay, so the first one is from Michelle, which is asking just if there are things like, given that you do such deep research within the spaces that you work, I feel like you could hold a PhD in as a tiger biologist, as a forest ecologist and silviculturalist, as well as now in terms of forest ecology. But can you share any examples of mitigation efforts that have particularly caught your eye?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are so many. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and so we can talk about reducing our, footprint in terms of emissions, but we can also talk about how to keep our communities from burning down. And I think it's called FireWise in Arizona, and I don't know, maybe elsewhere in the States, but Fire Smart up in Canada. We need to get with our firefighters. They know a lot. They live and breathe this stuff. They have a lot of information. They're quite dedicated. They are servants of the public. They're really good people, and you really want them on hand when things get difficult, and they want to share their knowledge. And so Fire Smart in Canada, and I'm sure most flammable nations and states and provinces have some equivalent to this. Firefighters will come to your neighborhood, come to your house, and look at it with you and help you assess the fire risk. And so everybody can reduce the risk of their community burning by double-digit percentages very, very easily. Because right now I'm looking at, I literally have a bale of straw sitting on my porch right now. A fire smart person would say, you probably want to move that bale of straw to your garage or put it out far away from your house. And
down near the mailbox.
Exactly, or maybe, get it off the property. And so and so much of it is acknowledging that this change is happening. And so instead of thinking, well, I'm going to live like it's 1990, this city never burned, so I'm not going to worry about it. Well, it's now possible. There's really no place that's off the table now. I mean, there was a wildfire in Greenland in 2017. And Greenland is, last we checked, was an ice cap, but
Right.
there is greenery there, and it managed to catch on fire. So it's different now, and I feel like that's a huge question. I have a lot of I could talk about it for a very long time. I do want to quote Chris Turner, who's a wonderful journalist and environmental writer here in Canada. He and Rebecca Solnit and I did an event together that was so exhilarating. You can find it online, and we have these different approaches to climate and optimism and how to move forward, but we were very complementary. And Chris Turner really had a teaching for me about 10 years ago. He was a new father, and he said, I realized when I became a father that I was morally obligated to be an optimist, that it really wasn't about how I felt that day. Is it a good day? Is it a bad day? This is a practice. It's a practice. And, I don't think there was there was never a promise, that life would be easy, or that planet Earth would be kind to us all the time. And we have to remember that we are descended from people who went through every hardship to get us here. We're that legacy, and it's a heroic legacy and incredible ingenuity. And our superpower really isn't our ability to combust every fossil fuel we come across as rapidly as possible. Our capacity, our superpower is our ability to work in community and adapt to new conditions and learn from past mistakes and successes. So that, we have that in abundance right now. And that's and the times are calling for us to reignite those skills and that superpower.
I love that. I love that. That's our superpower. And it is. I see it day in, day out in the work that we do, both within Canopy with the team as well as with our partners.
A perfect example.
I think one of the questions kind of riffs off that, or launches off that a little bit, and is a question from Akira about the example that you gave about Chevron relinquishing their offshore Jules, indeed, from Michelle, collective action for the win, indeed. They're wondering if you have any more information on that. And, of course, any decision like that, there is generally a lot of behind the scenes agitation that goes into that kind of a landmark decision. And so there's just a question from Akira as to whether you had any of that background information.
I don't, but what I do know is that Chevron has not just turned green. Chevron will burn the world down in front of your eyes for a profit. So will Exxon, and so will Suncor, and they have made this abundantly clear. This is not me being an angry tree hugger. This is me reading the business pages and hearing their quotes, hearing what Darren Woods says, hearing what Rich Kruger says. They are buying back stock. They're trying to maintain the dividends. They're trying to keep the shareholders happy. They're going to run the wheels off this thing. And I had an interesting conversation with a young lady who just got a job at BlackRock, and she's 21 years old and going 1,000,000 miles an hour and working her 100-hour weeks, paying her dues to maintain her visa because she's from overseas. And I asked her about oil and gas, and she said, well, when I started my business program, they asked me what areas I wanted to go into, insurance or energy or this or that, and oil and gas was my last choice. And she said, nobody really, wants to work in that anymore. And I said, and again, I'm a creature of the 20th century. There's a lot I don't know and understand intuitively about the 21st century that this young lady born in the 2000s is feeling and responding to. And I said, so do you think uh, oil and gas is a sunset industry? And she said, oh yeah, it's just, that's not where people her age are focusing.
Yeah, I
And
think
had
in
the
terms of
same.
talent and investment, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a whole culture change. When I grew up, Exxon was a blue chip stock. It's what smart people invested in. It was a huge hegemonic part of the landscape entity. Well, its status is much more tenuous now. And so this took 150 years to put in place. It's going to take some time to dismantle it and build the new infrastructure that we need for electric power and renewable power. But that is absolutely happening. And it's not happening as fast as we wished. It could have been started a lot sooner. And all these companies I just named are lobbying aggressively, hourly, by the millions and probably the billions to slow this down as long as possible. And that is called, in the words of Alex Steffen, predatory delay. And it's delaying necessary changes so that you can profit and so that the cost will be borne by somebody else down the road. Predatory delay is what we're seeing all across a lot of the automobile industry, across the petroleum industry, many chemical industries, and it is a force to be reckoned with. But we can and we will and we are.
Yeah, they are powerful forces, and I think within Canada, there's a recognition that the tar sands is a carbon intensive emitting kind of area or project industry. What's lesser known is that the logging of forests across Canada, much of which is old growth and carbon rich, is equivalent in terms of emissions on an annual basis. And so we have seen both, very powerfully with Exxon, with Chevron, with Shell engaging internationally to shift or water down the COP process or different policy initiatives. We've also seen, even within recently the EU put in place a deforestation regulation, and there were a number of governments and industries, Canada's included, that really pushed to have that regulation sort of have at least loopholes large enough to drive a large logging truck through. So these are big forces that we grapple against. Yes. I know that we're in the closing minutes, but I think, John, maybe just kind of one last thing, and we do have questions, and I'm so sorry to folks that have asked questions, and John and I have gotten carried away, but we will follow up with questions that haven't been answered. It's just wondering, in terms of your reflections with just coming back to that clima incognita concept, and how you see things shifting, right? Like we've got machine learning, which is doing prognostics of what to expect, but of course, like, it is not based on like what we've historically experienced. And so one of the other Tree Talk guests that we had was the Grand Chief of the Cree Grand Council, Mandy Gull, and she spoke to, there were 5 million hectares of forest within the Cree Nation territory that burnt last summer. Devastating impact on communities and on the traditional territories of the Cree. And just, at this juncture, historical industries, be it fossil fuels or, in this instance, the industrial forestry sector, needing to be kind of reevaluated. And just wondering how you see governments stepping up to that challenge.
Boy, it's so, I mean,
in 45 seconds or less, I'm just looking at the time and I'm getting pinged.
The election cycle is fundamentally unable to deal with environmental action in a meaningful way because the timelines are too out of phase with each other. So that's really a liability. And the other, quickly, is that we have all this great data, whether it's from AI or fire modeling or whatever, but it's only as good as the human processor who makes the decision based on it. And Fort McMurray, Fort McMurray fire was a great example of that. they had perfect forecasts, and they still didn't call the evacuation until the Shell station blew up, practically.
Yeah.
You know, and so you can give people all the information in the world, but they need to take it seriously and process it in context, in a useful way. And that's a big leap. And again, that's part of this sort of patchwork. You'll see some politicians who were very forward thinking, even ahead of their time, and you'll see others dragging their feet and in total denial. We've got that in spades on both sides in Canada, and lots of people in the mushy middle, uncertain what to do. And so it's going to be, there is absolutely progress happening, but it's in this uneven, sort of jerky, somewhat non-linear fashion. And that's also how climate change is impacting us. So it's a complex, dynamic situation we're in, but you know, we are cognizant. Conversations like this, I hope, move the needle. The work you're doing is absolutely crucial. The fact that as many people do, as you know, who want to engage with me on this, you know, really difficult, quite painful subject, means that, you know, there's a lot of courage and goodwill out there, and that really encourages me a lot.
That's great. I know we're out of time, John. We could keep talking for another hour, I think, but really, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your work in the space. Sure. For folks that haven't read it yet, then of course, feel free to run out to your local independent bookstore and buy Fireweather. And for those of you who are interested in supporting Canopy's work in any way, shape, or form, please don't hesitate to be in touch with Katie or Britt or myself. We will be sharing a recording of today's session in the coming days. If you had questions that we didn't get to, my apologies. That's my fault as the moderator of the conversation, but we will look back hopefully with some answers and responses to that. And just thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks so much, and lovely to see these hearts and hands coming up as little emojis, but our hearts and our hands are, you know, where the power is. And so good to see them here. So good to be with you.
And here's to channeling our superpower, which is learning, being creative, and working in community to drive solutions.
Yeah.